At the age of 32, it is still hard for me to talk about this, and this is why I chose to write about it. This form of communication is much less personal. It has been 23 years since it all took place. In the year of 1997, I was 9 years old. I am the only child in the family except for the dog we had at the time, Bear. My father is 10 years older than my mother. She was 20 when she gave birth to me, and my father was 30. Our small family was close and loving, and just as normal as all the other families in our middle-class neighborhood. My mother and my father worked full-time, so I spent a lot of time after school or during the summer with a babysitter. Always being with the babysitter wasn't that bad. My babysitter was named Sarah. She lived 4 doors down from us, and she had been my babysitter for the past 3 years, so we were quite used to each other. She was basically my older sister. Sarah had turned 18 2 months prior to her high school graduation. Come that July, she would be leaving state to start summer classes at her college. When my parents told me that Sarah would no longer be my babysitter, I immediately made a case about how I was ready to be without a babysitter. I mean, of course, at the age of 9, my parents protested this idea that I would be unsupervised all summer. "You might be responsible, son, but it is illegal for us to leave you alone," my father told me. Unfortunately for us, I would eventually get what I wanted. My mother found a new babysitter through a program that Sarah told her about. This program was through the school, and it would give girls ages 17 to 15 a chance to make some money. My mother would give her information and what would be needed from the sitter. The girls that have signed up for the program would pick what job they wanted to take. When my parents got the call that they had me a new babysitter, they were relieved. But on a Monday morning when my mother actually had to leave for work, I could tell she was nervous. I was just as nervous and a little upset, if not more. Having to stay home with a strange person was frightening at that age, and besides, I felt that she wasn't needed. At 7:55 Monday morning, Rachel arrived. That day, my mother ordered me to spend some time inside with her so I could get to know her, because she could possibly be there all summer. Being the good boy that I was, I did what she said. The first hour or so was kind of awkward. It consisted of me trying to avoid her by going from room to room as she followed and tried to ask me questions to break the ice. After realizing she would not leave me alone, I caved in and I started to answer her. Although most of the questions were short, she was still very nice and she always kept a smile on her face. After about an hour or two of getting to know each other, Rachel let me play some Sega while she did her homework. She wasn't as bad as I thought she would be. I learned that she was 16, and Rachel had moved to town last summer with her aunt that she lived with. My mother was happy when she learned that it all went well and that Rachel and I got along. My mother also promised to me that I didn't have to spend all day inside tomorrow, and this was good news to me. Within 15 minutes of Rachel's arrival on day 2, I left to ride my bike with my friend Dylan. She just smiled and she told me to be safe. I spent all day outside, getting home right before my mom and dad got off work. Once again, my parents were happy that the day went well. On day 3, everything started off normal. I was playing some Sega when Rachel came into my room. "Why don't you want to hang out with me?" she asked. I told her that I was just playing some games and that there wasn't really much else to do. We should get to know each other a little bit better. I remember looking at her kind of confused. "You and I have a lot more in common than you think," she said, sitting on my bed. I asked her what we could possibly have in common. "It's a secret, but for now let's play a game. We could play house. I'll be the older sister and you could be the little brother." I found it extremely odd that a 16-year-old girl would want to play a game with a 9-year-old boy. After about 30 minutes of this odd role play, I told her I was bored and I wanted to play something else. I remember her looking at me with a furrowed brow and that creepy smile she always wore. "We can never stop playing this game." That made me extremely uncomfortable, so I made some 9-year-old excuse and I walked out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the door. There I stayed until my mother got home. When my mother and I walked in together, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table just doing some homework. When my mother asked how she was doing, Rachel looked at my mother and, with that smile, "Where's Mr. Gregor?" she asked, referring to my father. My mother must have thought it to be odd that a young girl was asking for her husband because I could tell that my mom hurried her out of the house. After ushering her out, my mother asked me what I thought of Rachel. I told her that I thought she was weird, and I told her about the game of house she wanted to play. Once again, I saw an opportunity and I made my argument on being home alone, but once again I was denied. On day 4, everything changed. Once my mother left for work, Rachel asked me if I wanted to go for a bike ride. No matter who she was, being 9, I thought it was a great idea. We rode through my block and down the main road for about a mile. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and it seemed that she was taking me somewhere else. When we finally stopped, we were in front of a bunch of apartments. "You want to see my friends?" Rachel asked me. Without me answering her, she grabbed my hand and led me into the apartment complex. She took me to a door on the second floor and knocked on it. From behind the door, I could hear a man. "Who is it?" "It's me, Rachel." I could hear the man sigh. "Get out of here. I told you I don't want you around here anymore," the man said from behind the door. "I just wanted to show you my little brother," Rachel said in a loud voice. "Get the hell out of here. You're crazy," the man stated, sounding very annoyed. "My family is real. I told you I had a brother. He's right here. Look, he's real." "Get the hell out of here or I'm going to call the cops," said the man. At that point, Rachel pounded on the man's door with both fists and looked at me enraged. Out of nowhere, she just turned and started walking down the hallway back from where we came. I was petrified, and it took me a few seconds to realize that she was leaving me. I sprinted to catch up to her, and she never said a word when I did catch up. The whole bike ride back home, both of us were silent. When we got back to the house, I was still pretty shaken up, so I told her I was going to go to my friend Dylan's house. As I left through the garage door, she said something that has rang in my head to this day. "You're just like your father." That day, I waited at my friend's house till 5:30, which was about 30 minutes after my mom got home. When I walked in the door, my mother looked a little disturbed. She told me that when she came into the house, she found Rachel upstairs in my parents' room, laying in their bed. When my mother asked me how the day went, I told her what happened. I told her about riding on the main road that my parents have always forbidden me to do. My mother was furious. She told me to go back to Dylan's house and she would call me home for dinner. When I finally was allowed back home, I was nervous and scared that maybe I was in trouble. But to my relief, I wasn't. My mom told me that Rachel would no longer be my babysitter and that tomorrow I would be staying with Mr. and Mrs. Charles. They were an older couple across the street. Once again, I made my case about being home alone, but again, I was shut down. The next morning, I sat at Mr. and Mrs. Charles' house almost all day. They were nice enough, but they could not keep a 9-year-old entertained. Around 1 p.m., Mr. Charles was getting ready for his nap, and I asked Mrs. Charles if I could run home real quick to get a toy to play with. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing that my mother told her not to let me leave, but she could tell I was dying of boredom. When I got into the house, I was kind of scared knowing that I was all alone. I ran upstairs immediately to my room, and when I opened the door, I was startled to see Rachel in my room. She was wearing that creepy smile again. I took a deep breath in horror and took a few steps back. She lunged forward and grabbed me. Being scared and 9 years old, I didn't know what to do. Rachel pulled out some rope that she found in our garage. She tied up my hands behind my back and tied my feet to the bedpost. After she realized I wasn't going anywhere, she relaxed a bit. She pulled out a small pocket knife from one of her pockets. For the next 3 hours, she proceeded to explain to me that my dad was also her dad. Between her crying and pacing back and forth, she said that our dad left her mother when Rachel was born from my mom. Rachel kept telling me that I took her family and that I was the reason she couldn't be happy. But I would pay. We just have to wait for our dad to get home so he knows what he has done. I was absolutely horrified. I couldn't yell, fight, or scream for help. All I could do was cry. I thought that I was going to die by this girl and her pocket knife. After sitting tied up for several hours, I thought all was hopeless. While Rachel was sitting on my bed with a blank stare in between her crying, I could hear what I thought was the sound of someone walking up the stairs. "La Palma Police, is there anyone upstairs?" At that exact moment, Rachel snapped up. I screamed louder than ever I have in my whole life. While I screamed for help, Rachel climbed behind me and put the knife to the side of my face. I could feel her heavy breath on the back of my neck. A police officer turned the corner of my room and pulled his gun out. He looked at both of us, and I could see the change in his face when he realized the situation. He slowly put his gun back in his holster. "Okay, what's going on here?" asked the policeman. Already crying, Rachel screamed, "I just want my family." About 20 minutes went by with the policeman trying to calm Rachel down. When 2 more cops showed up, Rachel's attitude changed. She got more aggressive and at this point was pushing the blade into the meat of my arm. All I could do was cry and whimper for help. In between arguing with the police, crying and waving the knife around, she would whisper to me, "It'll all be over soon." Without Rachel realizing, one of the cops moved into a position to where he could tase and subdue her without getting me hurt. The rest of the night I don't quite remember. All I can see is Rachel being tackled to the floor. I remember my mom and dad crying when I was cut free and on the way to the hospital for stitches. I had to get 6 stitches. My parents never talked about this summer, probably in hopes that it would be forgotten. But I could never forget what happened to me. At the age of 18, I asked my dad what he could remember from that night. I could tell he was uncomfortable about telling me, but said that I was old enough. What he told me made the whole situation worse. He said that the babysitter, Rachel's real name was Amanda. Her mother died in a house fire a year prior to us meeting her. Amanda was nowhere to be found and was reported missing after the fire. She was the only suspect they had for the house fire. Her father did in fact leave her mother when she was born, but later died in a car accident shortly afterwards. She was never actually related to my family, and it was just a complete mental breakdown, I guess. Mrs. Charles had dozed off after I went to get that toy. When she woke up 2 hours later, she remembered me, and when the cops showed up to my house, the front door was left wide open. This really freaked me out because none of us could have avoided this. This Amanda girl was going to lose it eventually, and it just happened to be with me and my family. She's locked up now and serving life in some sort of mental institution for the murder of her mother. The hardest part of all of this is the fact that I now have a 9-year-old myself. He's an only child, other than our dog Odin. My wife and I work full-time, but our long-term babysitter is quitting for a real job, and I'm not sure what to do. After the summer of '94, my parents felt that I no longer needed a babysitter. So I'm stuck with this question. Do I leave my 9-year-old home alone all summer, or do I find a stranger to watch him?